Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to this session. My name is David Hewitt. I'm an Asian oil and gas analyst with Credit Suisse. Geopolitics has always been an integral feature in the oil and gas business, but with Mideast tensions very much to the fore, along with Asia and specifically China's increasingly voracious appetite for global resources, I think this is an opportune time to revisit the theme. So we're delighted to introduce Robert Kaplan, newly appointed Chief Geopolitical Analyst at Stratfor. In Robert's extensive career, he's published 13 books, numerous papers in the international affairs field. He's lectured at military war colleges, the CIA, FBI, and the Pentagon, and recently served on the US Defense Policy Board. Robert's going to speak for about 30 minutes and outline his views in terms of energy security, primarily around APAC, but can broaden it, and we'll make sure we leave plenty of time for question and answer at the end. Robert, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. Let me get right into it. We've all been prisoners of two things over the decades: the Mercator projection and Cold War area studies. The Mercator projection, is the map used in the United States with North and South America in the center. And that's a distortion because with North and South America at the center, you have the Atlantic and Eastern Pacific Oceans at the edges, and the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific get cut off and are just split apart. Whereas if you look at a demographic map of the world in 2050, you'll see that 7 of 9 billion people on the planet will live in the greater Indian Ocean area. That's East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And especially, we've been prisoners of Cold War area studies. This is what I mean. At the end of World War II, the United States and the West found themselves global powers. And they needed area experts for each part of the world in order to run the empire, so to speak. And so the world was artificially divided into various regions: the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Northeast Asia, and so on. Where in fact, in our world today, what we have is a fluid organic continuum where all of these regions interact constantly to a degree that we've never seen before. So that North Korea and Northeast Asia can give Syria in the Middle East nuclear technology that elicits an Israeli military response. It can mean that China in East Asia and India and South Asia compete for natural gas rights in Myanmar in Southeast Asia. It means India and China compete for natural gas on the Iranian plateau. Everyone is interacting to a degree never seen before. And so, what we're really talking about is a Eurasian rimland. The southern navigable rimland of Eurasia is the key part of the world, from the Horn of Africa all the way across the Indian Ocean, which is the global energy interstate, bringing oil and natural gas from the greater Middle East, all the way to the middle-class conurbations of coastal China, South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. So it's this navigable rimland across the Indian Ocean, sweeping around through the Strait of Malacca and the Lombok, Makassar, and Sunda Straits of Indonesia, all the way up to the Sea of Japan. Of course, the northern rimland of Eurasia is ice-blocked for much of the year, and that's why I say the southern rimland. And what distinguishes this southern rimland is the monsoon wind system. And the monsoon wind system is unique because it's utterly predictable. Winds go northeast, southwest for 6 months a year, change 180 degrees southwest, northeast for another 6 months of the year. And because they're utterly predictable, sailing distances could be predicted in advance could be calculated in advance, and that is why you had deep back into the early medieval era, you had Yemenis from the Middle East living in large numbers in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, why you had Malays from Southeast Asia living in Madagascar off East Africa, why you had Omanis from southeastern Arabia living all along the East African coast. It's why you find the remains of Arab mosques in coastal China today. Everyone was everywhere since early medieval times because of the predictability of the wind system. And the reason I bring this up is because this is the world we have today, where everyone is everywhere in terms of energy routes, which I'm about to get into. Now, notice emphasizing significantly the sea, maritime, the Indian Ocean. And the reason for that is that even in this jet and information age that we live in, 90% of all commercial goods that travel intercontinentally travel by sea, by container ship, by oil tanker or whatnot. Globalization is all about sea traffic, tanker traffic. And this tanker traffic requires safe and predictable sea lines of communication. That's why an organization like the United States Navy for the past few decades and the U.S. Air Force have been so central to globalization. It is because of the protection of the sea lines of communication that piracy has been kind of consigned to the exotic edges to the exotic edges of the security system, at least until recently, and therefore to allow globalization to proceed apace. Another feature of this world is that it allows us to see Islam in an entirely different light than we had before. Because most people think of Islam as a desert religion spread by the sword quickly across the North African desert, while in fact, when you look at a greater Indian Ocean map, including the South China Sea, you see an Islamic faith that was spread gradually over hundreds and hundreds of years by cosmopolitan merchants in sea traffic. And that's why the eastern half of Islam is so different than the western half. It's why the eastern half, Malaysia, Bangladesh, India to some extent, the Arakan coast of Burma and Indonesia have been experimenting with democracy for decades already and didn't require an Arab Spring. Another point, I put the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific together because with the increase in tanker traffic and the fact that global energy demands are going to increase by about 45% over the next 20 years, with half of that coming from India and China, we're going to need more routes from the Bay of Bengal into the South China Sea. Talk about a Kra Canal across the Isthmus of Kra in southern Thailand is coming up again. That would be an engineering feat on the scale of the Panama Canal. It would cost about $20 billion. Dubai Ports World is doing a feasibility study about land bridges across the peninsular Malaysia, roads and pipelines where ships could dock on the Bay of Bengal side and the goods would be taken up on the South China Sea side. Because geography still rules in this respect. Despite all our communications technology, the Strait of Malacca is no wider now than it was 500 years ago. And 82% of all of China's crude oil imports still come through that narrow strait. And this makes the Chinese nervous. It makes what Hu Jintao spoke of as our Malacca dilemma. And this gets into the heart of the story I want to tell this afternoon, which is that in this greater Indian Ocean world, The West, which has ruled for 500 years, since Vasco da Gama sailed in only 23 days from East Africa to India because he had an Arab navigator aboard who knew the secrets of the monsoon winds. Since Vasco da Gama's voyage, since the Portuguese seaborne empire based in Goa, south of Mumbai, since the Dutch Empire, the British Royal Navy, and the American Navy and Air Force, after 500 years, we're finally seeing a plateauing and a gradual receding of Western power and the rise of indigenous nations throughout this region, not just in a political and economic sense, but very much in a military, air, and sea sense. Because as energy routes multiply, as oil and natural gas flow, it's not just the Americans who can protect the sea lines of communication into the future. It's a rising Chinese military power, for instance, that will eventually want to protect its own sea lines of communication. So it doesn't depend on the United States. And that requires not just a coastal navy of ultra-quiet diesel-electric submarines, but a blue water oceanic navy with nuclear-powered submarines, etc. Let me say at first, I'm going to talk a bit later about China's military rise. China's military rise is wholly natural and non-threatening in my view, because China is rising very much in the way the United States, my country, rose after the end of the Civil War in 1865. The United States, at the end of the Civil War, experienced several decades of unimpeded economic growth, of double-digit economic growth, and in the process of developing the greatest industrial economy in the world, began trading with all the four corners of the earth, and then realized it needed a blue water navy to defend those trading links. And so Teddy Roosevelt dug the Panama Canal and built a great white navy. And China is doing likewise. So it's a very natural, organic progression that's going on. Now, China's energy needs. Speaking geopolitically, the United States and the Soviet Union were missionary powers. I say that because they promoted an ideology. The United States promoted the ideology of democracy, and the Soviet Union the ideology of communism. China does not have an ideology as such. China seeks, it seeks benevolence, it will harmony, it will deal with any regime, democratic or dictatorial, but it's a very soft philosophy. It's not a hard philosophy like the United States of the Soviet Union. China's foreign policy, therefore, seems to be driven by the need to acquire natural resources wherever they can. Natural resources being oil, natural gas, strategic minerals, and strategic metals, in order to lift the living standards of not tens but hundreds of millions of people into the global middle class. That is why China has its eye on the Russian Far East, north of Manchuria, where only 4.5 million people live compared to 100 million people in Manchuria. China has its eye on the oil, gas, timber, diamonds, and gold in that region that it can exploit. It has its eye on Mongolia, outer Mongolia, that is, with Mongolia's oil, coal, uranium, and grasslands, which Chinese corporations covet. China has its eye on Xinjiang in the western part of China, populated to a large degree by Muslim Uyghur Turks, where there's oil, gas, copper, and iron ore. In other words, China geographically is a Han cradle of civilization, an island, so to speak. It's virtually surrounded by high plateau lands that are very, very rich in the natural resources that China requires. But that's not enough for China. China has been building pipelines from Turkmenistan and Central Asia taking natural gas into China. It has been building pipelines from Kazakhstan and the Caspian Sea region, bringing oil into Western China directly. These are all ways, large and small, to escape from the Malacca dilemma that I mentioned earlier. And China needs close relations with Central Asian powers in order to deny the Turkic Uyghurs within China itself a rear base were they ever to rise up in a more substantial way than they have. You know, if central control in China through some socioeconomic crisis were ever to weaken. But all this is not enough for China. To escape the Malacca dilemma, and to have portages for its blue, and to have coaling stations for its blue water navy, so to speak. Think of China as these indigenous powers rise, and as the West gradually plateaus and recedes. Think of China moving vertically south towards the Indian Ocean, and India moving horizontally eastward and westward along the Indian Ocean. China has been building state-of-the-art deep water ports, or helping to finance them, in Lamu in northern Kenya, in Gwadar in Pakistan near the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, in Chittagong in Bangladesh, in Kayuk Fru in Burma, in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. I have visited almost all of these ports, and I can tell you it is a great age in history to be a Chinese civil engineer, because the Chinese are really building things, kind of like the Americans built things in the 1930s when they built the Grand Coulee Dam and the Hoover Dam out west when Franklin Delano Roosevelt put Americans back to work. At Hambantota in southern Sri Lanka, close to the global sea lines of communication where 30,000 merchant ships pass each year, the Chinese are literally moving the coast inland by several hundred yards. You know, I've never seen a bigger construction site anywhere. What is all this about? This is about getting oil eventually from southern Sudan across a pipeline to Lamu in Kenya. It's about on some future morrow, if Pakistan and Afghanistan were to stabilize, China could build routes and pipelines from Gwadar in Pakistan northward into western China, though I emphasize this is a long-range scenario. I've been to Gwadar. There is nothing there except Baluchistan rebel activity. It's a very insecure area. The Chinese were to build an oil refinery near their new port. They decided not to. China just the other day decided not to finance an oil pipeline from Iran into Pakistan, to a large extent because I believe because of pressure from the United States not to do so. So Gwadar port is go slow in terms of taking Middle East oil and natural gas for pipeline directly into Western China. However, what is moving ahead very fast is the port complex off the coast of Myanmar or Burma, where the Chinese are hoping to build a pipeline and road system directly across Burma into Yunnan province in southern China. The problem there could be the Kachin rebels, who the Myanmar government has still not negotiated a full truce with. But this is all, one thing that's very interesting that's happened only in the past year is the gradual opening up of Burma could unleash roads and pipelines in all directions that would mainly help India in this way, because India is building a port complex north of China's at Sitwe, about 50 miles north, hoping to harness the natural gas off the Burmese coast and pipeline it through Bangladesh or around Bangladesh directly into India. Were Burma to open up, than the northeast chicken bone part of India, which is the part of India sandwiched between Bangladesh and Myanmar, which has been home to about 15 ethnic insurgencies over the past few decades, is underdeveloped because it's been in a geographic kind of dead end because of the closed nature of the Burmese regime and the underdevelopment of Bangladesh. But were Myanmar to open up considerably politically, economically, this would solve the northeastern India's problem. There would be less refugees going into Kolkata and other places. There would be development all through West Bengal and northeast India. And this would help link India closer to Southeast Asia. And therefore, India would be in a better position to hedge or balance against China in this South Asian, East Asian security system. So rather than a blockage point, a liberated Burma could see China, Southeast Asia, India, all interlinked through pipeline routes. That would go through it. Now, so this is China. Get sort of the 21st century equivalent of 19th century British coaling stations all along the Indian Ocean. These ports are being developed by private Chinese companies. There's no military activity there. They would be sort of throughput facilities for warehousing Chinese merchandise for export to the Middle East and Europe. When I was in Beijing for 2 weeks in December, the Chinese, they kept saying to me, these are just companies doing this. Our ports along the Indian Ocean have no imperial or military significance in any way. But my answer was, that's how the Venetian Empire started. That's how the British Empire started. Empires don't start when politicians sit around a room and decide we're going to become an empire. They start as very small, tentative commercial ventures. The Venetians got, kind of trickling down the Adriatic coast of the former Yugoslavia, setting up commercial outposts, and 150 years later, controlling all of the Eastern Mediterranean. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, these ports and the port building that China is also doing at Piraeus in Greece, at Rijeka in Croatia, could be nothing less than the start of a peaceful maritime continuum that would connect China all the way to Europe through the Suez Canal. In this regard. Now, India is moving east and west in this sense. One of the most talked about people in Indian leadership circles, at least in a relative sense, in recent years, has been Lord George Nathaniel Curzon, the British Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905. And that is because Curzon's strategic vision is relevant to India today. Curzon saw a greater India from what is today Pakistan to what is today Burma, with shadow zones of influence in the Iranian plateau, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. China builds a port in Gwadar with the Pakistanis near the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. The Indians get nervous, so they enlarge their port at Karwar, south of Mumbai, on India's Konkan coast. The port at Gwadar, suddenly the Indians helped the Iranians to start developing the Iranian port of Chabahar on the Arabian Sea, about 150 miles west of Gwadar. What is going on? The future of Central Asia and Central Asian oil and natural gas is not only for pipelines to go across Russia into China, but also to go southward toward the Indian Ocean, through Iran to Chabahar, through Pakistan to Gwadar. If Pakistan and Afghanistan ever stabilize, And if we were to say ultimately the Americans were to help some sort of stabilization in Afghanistan, the beneficiaries would not be the United States. They would be all the countries around Afghanistan, which would suddenly, because Afghanistan, like Burma and Afghanistan at peace, would elicit trade routes and pipelines going in all directions across of it. It would see a natural gas pipeline coming from Turkmenistan across Afghanistan down to the Pakistani port of Karachi. The Americans keep asking themselves, how can we leave Afghanistan? The Chinese often ask themselves, how can we stay? How can we mine the lithium and other minerals in Afghanistan? Now, keep in mind, these routes going all over the place, as I said, lead to military, particularly naval and air expenditures. The United States Navy peaked at about 586 warships during the era of Ronald Reagan. It's now down to 284 warships. The plan is to raise it to 313, but the Congressional Budget Office and others, because of cost overruns, the debt crisis, means that we may be looking at a United States Navy of 250 warships in about 2 decades. That would have profound significance for a world with 250 U.S. warships is a different world than one with 350 warships. A world with the lower number means a more multipolar military environment to go along with the already existing multipolar economic and political environment. As I said, China's building a great navy. In 15 years, it will have as many submarines as the United States. And we live in an era of submarines. They are the new bling for Asia, in a sense. And the reason is because as surface warships, particularly aircraft carriers, become more and more susceptible to the latest ballistic missile technology, naval warfare is going undersea. The Chinese now have 66 submarines. They're going to go up to over 70. The Vietnamese just purchased 4 Russian Kilo-class submarines. The Australians, a country of only 23 million people, are going to spend $279 billion on new submarines, fighter jets, and other air and naval hardware over the next 20 years. Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea are modernizing at a very fast rate their air and naval forces. We live in an era where, because of all the energy coming from the Middle East to East Asia, that the real military buildup is transferring from Europe in the western protuberance of the Eurasian supercontinent all the way to East Asia at the other end. And it's not, what you see in East Asia is not the ox and cow armies of the early Cold War era, where Malaysia and Vietnam and other places were involved in internal, irregular, dirty wars. What we're seeing now are real civilian military post-industrial complexes projecting outward into air and sea. And this really all comes together with what I call the phenomenon of the South China Sea. The South China Sea functions as the throat of the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans, the massive connective economic tissue where global sea routes coalesce. The oil transported through the Strait of Malacca from the Indian Ocean through the South China Sea is triple the amount that passes through the Suez Canal. It's 15 times the amount that passes through the Panama Canal. 2/3 of South Korea's energy supplies, 60% of Japan's and Taiwan's energy supplies, and as I said, 80% of China's crude oil imports all go through the South China Sea. In addition, the South China Sea has proven oil reserves of 7 billion barrels and an estimated 900 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And if Chinese calculations are correct, that the South China Sea will ultimately yield 130 billion barrels of oil, and there is a lot of doubt about those estimates. then the South China Sea may contain as much oil as anywhere in the globe with the exception of Saudi Arabia. And the Chinese are making heavy investments there. The South China Sea is fraught. It's fraught with, with extremely complex, overlapping legal claims by all the littoral states about who owns what territory. The Vietnamese, the Malaysians, the Philippines especially, are all claiming 200 miles out, and there's a reason for it. The law of the sea is actually about the land, not the sea, because it uses the land as the basis to calculate what you own in the sea. And so the law of the sea is about pushing out 200 miles. And that gets all of these countries. It gets them the Spratly Islands, the Paracels, all the area where oil and natural gas is supposed to be rich. But the law of the sea pressing outward from China's southeastern coast only gets China into the deep center of the South China Sea, where there's relatively few energy deposits. So we're in a very ironic situation where the United States, which did not sign the Law of the Sea Treaty, obeys its regulations in supporting all these littoral countries, whereas China, which did sign the Law of the Sea, is casting it aside in this particular case and claiming an historic line that many Chinese elites actually want to compromise on. An historic line that nevertheless claims the large heart of the seabed. We're seeing more and more submarines in the South China Sea from all these countries, especially the United States and China. The United States, China sees the South China Sea, and I'm wrapping up here, sort of like the United States saw the Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th century. The United States became a great global power because it came to dominate the greater Caribbean basin. And once it did that, it could dominate the Western Hemisphere and still had power to spare to affect the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere. If China could hold sway in the South China Sea and get a large share of those energy reserves, it would again help solve its Malacca dilemma and would allow China to really concentrate on the Indian Ocean and the blue water oceans in terms of building a great navy. But all these claimant countries and the United States seem to be banding together to prevent China to do that. This is not leading to war. I'm not being an alarmist. The United States-Chinese relationship is so complex with tens of thousands of businessmen, tens of thousands of students going through Beijing to Washington to both countries that it will have hard and soft edges. The softest edges will be the bilateral continual talks on economic things, but the harder edge of that relationship will be naval competition, particularly in the South China Sea. That will be literally a fact of life in our era over the next 10 or 15 years. So what we see, in summing up, is a world of increasing middle class, increasing energy routes and pipelines that where countries increasingly want navies and air forces to help protect. So it will be an incredibly interconnected world, but a world also of strong nationalisms that we should not forget and dismiss. Thank you.
Wonderful. Robert, thank you. I feel like I've just stood in front of a globe that's spinning at 100 miles an hour. It's just an incredible summary. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to lead with one question, then I'm going to open to the floor, so we'll get ready with mics. The other aside that I would make is that I think property prices in Darwin are going to go down. If $270 billion has been spent by the Australians, they must be worried that somebody's coming. My question would be, has the US strategy genuinely shifted into APAC? Is it a refocus area? Is it beyond party politics, and does it continue if the current president doesn't get re-elected?
The so-called U.S. pivot to Asia, summarized by Hillary Clinton in a magazine article in November, was actually supposed to happen 20 years ago. When the Berlin Wall fell, there was the policy elite focused on Asia. Then what happened was Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, which led not only to a war 6 months later, but to a no-fly zone, which tied up the U.S. Air Force and Navy for 12 years afterwards. And then came 9/11. Then came the two ground wars in the Middle East. And now that the two ground wars are winding down, rather than retreat into semi-isolationism, which the United States did after many of its previous wars to deleterious results, the United States is shifting naturally to the part of the world that is, in a demographic, economic sense, the geographic heart of the world, in terms of numbers of middle-class people, economic activity, and presence of world navies and air forces. So the pivot is genuine. It's supported by both sides. Asia is not an area in a geopolitical sense that has divided Democrats and Republicans. The Middle East has divided Democrats and Republicans. But policy towards China, towards Asia, has generally been bipartisan since Nixon went to China, with very few variations through all the American presidents. And that would continue. So if Obama is reelected, if, for instance, Governor Romney is elected, I don't see policy in the Pacific or the kind of move to the Pacific to change. One last thing, the pivot to Asia is not a declaration, it's an aspiration. It's an aspiration because it assumes that events in the Middle East will permit. And let me tell you, events in the Middle East never permit. Once you finish with one thing in the Middle East, something else comes to grab you from behind.
Wonderful. Questions from the floor, if there are any. Let's start with the gentleman just there, and then I'll come to you. Yep.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that aircraft carriers are becoming vulnerable to emerging ballistic anti-ship technology. Does this mean that, today's modern version of gunboat diplomacy, i.e., aircraft carrier diplomacy, that's going to have to change or evolve?
It's going to evolve very, very slowly. The Chinese are developing, are manning their first aircraft carrier, which is actually, in all due respect, a Ukrainian, an old Ukrainian amphibious ship that really doesn't affect China's naval capability, but it is a prestige symbol. It's a statement, and that's why China's building it. China saw how a U.S. aircraft carrier was instrumental to the Indonesian tsunami relief in 2004, which gave the United States a lot of prestige, helped the United States in its relationship with the Indonesian military, etc. So China will have a few aircraft carriers nevertheless. The U.S. is spending $12 billion to build the first of the Gerald R. Ford class carriers, and with the fighter jets on top of that, the price rises to $18 billion. There's speculation in Washington this may be the first and the last of the Gerald R. Ford class of carriers, that the age of carriers is slowly ending, but here's their use. They can be used, as I said, for humanitarian emergencies, which should not be dismissed out of hand. They can be used to show the flag as a statement of power. They can also be used as an offshore air base where you don't need the permission of the host country to launch fighter jets from. And in an age when it's harder and harder to have, fixed Cold War-style Burger King army bases, like the U.S. had in Germany and Turkey, the carrier does serve a purpose. But because it is increasingly vulnerable, the focus of naval warfare is gradually starting to move away from the carrier.
Excellent. Gentleman at the front. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of points. When Secretary Clinton visited Aung San Suu Kyi, that is obviously part of the larger policy of applying influence to that country. I don't know how successful that is. My second point is, obviously, in both countries, China and the US, there are still both the Gulf group and the hawkish group in both government, military, CIA, whatnot. My point is, in a military exercise, obviously, if the US is to apply military exercise, Chinese military will send ships to observe the American exercise. When the two groups are in such close proximities, wars have begun this way. My question is, how do you access the risk of miscalculations by both countries, not by the Gulf group, but by the hawkish group in both military governments and whatnot? How do you access the risk?
Yeah, for the first question, Secretary Clinton, since she assumed office as Secretary of State, has made a point of traveling back and forth to Asia. She's been to Vietnam several times. She's, taken a deep interest in Myanmar. She's been to Australia. It's like she's shuttling back and forth to Asia, and there's a reason for this, a political reason. She's making a point that the Obama administration is not going to ignore Asia the way the Bush administration was alleged to, when I believe Secretary of State Condi Rice went a year without visiting Asia. So tied up was she with Iraq and Afghanistan and Israel-Palestine. So even before her pivot article in Foreign Policy magazine, she was making the point that this administration is going to focus on what's real important. I think that, when you go to Beijing and you see tens of thousands of American business people, and I think the U.S. Embassy there just issued its 1 millionth visa to a Chinese student or something to go to the U.S. And I covered Eastern Europe during the Cold War as a journalist. And I can tell you that the U.S.-Chinese relationship is on such a more multifaceted, rich, texturous level than the U.S. relationship with any of the communist regimes during the Cold War, that to call this a new Cold War misses the whole point. I think that all the facets of the U.S.-China relationship will work hard to prevent the kind of incidents that you worry about. But incidents will happen. When you have a sea crowded with warships, as we saw with the EP-3 spy plane that was brought down by China in the months before 9/11, we saw when a Chinese submarine surfaced in the middle of the USS Kitty Hawk battle group in 2007, incidents happen. And when they happen, it's important to have a bilateral military-to-military relationship to calm down tensions immediately. And Secretary Gates, when he was Secretary of State, one of his highest priorities was to reestablish bilateral mill-to-mill ties with the Chinese. And Secretary Panetta has followed up on that. And finally, we have the U.S. and the Chinese militaries talking to each other, but not nearly at the levels that they need to. I'll tell you a subject they really need to talk about, but they won't. And that's what would happen if we were to have a sudden regime crisis in North Korea. Remember, Vietnam, Yemen, East Germany, these were all examples of divided countries that reunited in the most tumultuous, unpredictable fashion within a number of weeks due to regime collapse or something. We don't want a situation where you'll have the People's Liberation Army and the United States forces Korea having to stabilize the situation in the northern half of the Korean peninsula without the two militaries talking to each other on an intimate level months in advance. So yes, there's mill-to-mill ties to alleviate what you worry about, but they're not nearly at the level they need to be.
Great. Gentleman at the back. Yeah.
This year, we're relying on the U.S. Fifth Fleet to keep the Straits of Hormuz open if that should be needed. If you take the energy projections over the next 10 years, and by the middle of the next decade, North America will be self-sufficient in hydrocarbons, and China will be needing to at least double, perhaps treble, its imports of oil from the Middle East. So should it be the Chinese Navy that should take over policing of the Straits of Hormuz?
Theoretically, yes, but that's not the world we live in at the moment. First of all, China lacks the naval capabilities to do so. It's building a blue water navy. It doesn't have one. And the hardest part of building a blue water navy, as I learned being an embedded journalist on submarines and destroyers, is that you can buy the hardware, but training the crews take a generation or more. You know, to have 300 men on a nuclear-powered submarine operate in unison is an art more than a science. And, you know, and it has to do with the tradition of seamanship that the Chinese are just building. The Chinese at the moment are free riding off the protection of the world's sea lanes across the Indian Ocean that the U.S., you know, in fact provides. So the Chinese are looking on this. And the U.S. has just brought new minesweepers into the Strait of Hormuz region. It's brought in an extra aircraft carrier. The U.S. is clearly shouldering the burden. But we're at an inflection point in history, I believe. In 20 years or so, there may be more Indian warships in the Strait of Hormuz area than U.S. warships, because the strategic interest of the U.S. will gradually decline as you know, as various forms of energy dramatically come online in the Western Hemisphere for the United States.
Gentleman there, yes.
You didn't touch much on Japan, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on this increased influence of sea line protection by China and how Japan looks at it from their perspective.
Yes. Japan, you know, people look at Japan in a cliche way. They say, oh, the Japanese, they're quasi-pacifistic and their economy has been in the doldrums for the longest time. But if you step back a bit and you see that Japan still has the world's third largest economy, and it has 123 state-of-the-art warships with, you know, with a state-of-the-art Air Force and Special Forces component. And the Japanese Navy is more than 4 times the size of the British Royal Navy. It's very deployable. They do lots of exercises. It's a Navy and Air Force designed to fight, not just to show. Japan is gradually normalizing its psychological attitude towards military force. When the North Koreans in 1998 shot their first missile across Japan, that did more than many, many Japanese white papers on the subject to get Japan thinking about its military. The military rise of China that's naturally accompanying China's economic rise also is focusing Japanese you know, Japanese minds. Now, of course, one thing I didn't touch upon, which is, as we all know, economic growth in China is slowing. China could have a serious socio-economic political crisis. This could lead to more nationalism in China or less nationalism. It could lead to greater defense budgets or lower defense budgets. None of us know that. None of us know which way it will go. But if China continues to develop its military might, that's going to lead to a commensurate growth in Japan's military. And if China were to falter, Japan would be there with the third largest economy and a massive Navy and Air Force. Would assume the role of of a mini great power again. So don't discount Japan, I would say.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Gentleman at the front.
I wonder how the U.S. will convince those who use the sea lanes that we have the willingness to use our power in the future.
I think that what's very interesting is that the use of military force, I've learned as a journalist, depends not on how many ships and planes or soldiers you have, but the civil-military relationship within the country itself. Despite the failure of the Iraq and Afghan wars, if we can call it such, the military is very highly regarded in the United States. Americans love their military. They revere them. Their social prestige accrued in Washington to, to being in the military, being a Vietnam War veteran. And what this leads to, as in the cases of other countries where militaries are revered, is that the space, the political space to use force is greater. The political space to use force is very narrow in Europe. During the Libyan campaign, I think only 8 of 28 countries involved were actually allowed to drop bombs. You had air forces fly sorties, but they were not allowed by their own parliaments back home to drop bombs. That's because the civil-military relationship in European countries, with some exceptions, is not as healthy as that in the United States. Many European countries see their militaries as civil servants in funny uniforms that are great for humanitarian relief and peacekeeping, but cannot be used in any traditional warrior role. That's not the case in the United States, and I think, therefore, there should be no doubt that the U.S. would use force if force was required. Having said that, the U.S. is burnt out, I believe. Washington is burnt out from Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's determined that if to avoid hostilities with Iran, and if it is not possible to avoid hostilities with Iran, then hostilities with Iran would be limited to an air and naval content and would involve no boots on the ground. So that's where we're at. Thank you.
So we've just crossed to the 0 point. I think we're going to have to stop there. I thank you all for coming today, but please thank Robert. Fascinating conversation.